All right. I didn't ask anybody to lead prayer. Eric, would you lead us?
But we give, we're thankful that we can come here this morning, we can study your word, we pray that you'll be with Ken this morning as he's prepared a lesson for us, and we'll take that lesson and apply it to our lives. We ask that you call us and forgive us what we failure. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
All right. All of these stories or parables that we are studying were during the Lord's Perean ministry. And as I've stressed over and over and over, 1 month from now, he's going to be dead. He's going to be on the cross dying for our sins. And these are the lessons, the last lessons that he wanted his audience to hear. And that's why I think we need to give due attention to his last will and testament, if I may use that phrase, with regard to these 6 stories or parables that we're going to study. Carl and whoever else last week passed these out, but I have a few lessons on the unfortunate widow. Do any of you need one? Everybody's got one? Chase, you need one? Okay. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. All right. Jason? Thank you, Carl. Now, as I asked the question last week, I'll ask it again. What does it mean to be importunate? What does importunity mean? Don't all speak at once. I can't hear all of you at once. All right, it means persistence, sticking with it. You know, just keep pursuing something and never letting up. Here's a widow who has a legal issue. She goes to a judge who couldn't care less about her or her situation, and yet she keeps going to him so many times he finally says, goodness, this woman is wearing me out. I am going to take care of her. That's exactly the lesson that God wants us to understand. And this is one of the most frequently taught subjects in the entire Bible, importunity. Moses, how many times did he pray for his obstinate people? When God many times said, I'm going to wipe them out and I'm going to start over with you. And I'm going to build a new nation. And Moses, over and over and over and over, kept praying, no, 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 these are your people, these are my people. And God always relented. Always relented. Where's my Bible? I guess I need my interlinear, honey. Thank you. All right, turn to Luke 11. Let me give you another lesson on importunity. All right, in Luke 11, beginning, well, really 5 through 10, and he said unto them, which of you shall go to a friend, or have a friend, and go unto him at midnight, and say unto him, friend, lend me 3 loaves. The friend, my friend on a journey, is come to me, and I have nothing to set before him. And he from within shall answer and say, trouble me not, the door is now shut, and my children are with me in bed. I cannot rise and give thee. I say unto you, though he will not rise and give him because he is his friend, yet because of his importunity, he will rise and give him as many as he needeth. Here's a picture in the ancient Middle East. Your average house of your average person was a one-room house. That room was divided. There was the floor level, and then the other half of the house was on a raised level. On this raised level, the whole family, that's where the stove was, and the whole family slept on the floor on this raised level. They had to bring all their animals in every night, and they slept on the lower level or the floor level. So you have your sheep. If you have a donkey, can you imagine sleeping in the house with these? Could you do that, Faye? All right. But hospitality was the greatest gesture of the people of the ancient Middle East, Near East. Houses were not owned in Israel. They belonged to the state. And every house welcomed visitors. Every house welcomed visitors. That was their culture. As you were traveling through Jerusalem, you knew you were welcome at every house because they didn't have locks like we have today. Of course, they didn't have the weirdos that we have today either. And so here was a friend who came to another friend. And it would be embarrassing if this friend to whom he came did not have anything wherewith to greet him. A meal, a basin of water to wash his feet, and things like that. So and not having anything, he immediately goes to another friend and tries to procure these things. Well, this other friend is already on that upper level, laying down, and no telling how many children or family members he has to step over just to go to the door. And it says it's locked, but they didn't have the kind of locks that we have. But this friend kept what? And finally, the guy says, look, everybody's disturbed already. I'm going to get up and I'm going to give him whatever he needs. And he goes back and he entertains or he fellowships this other friend who came to him. That is a normal picture. And by the way, let me insert this since Justin and Danielle are here. Jack set me straight a few weeks ago. Some of you already know this, but he's not around. So Debbie was walking out of this auditorium holding Jack's hand with her left hand. I said, hello, Debbie. Jack looked at me and said, she's BB. I said, oh, I'm sorry, I used the wrong name. So now I call Debbie BB every time I see her because I never know where Jack's going to be. So I learned that there is a BB. She's married to a Bebo. We have a Babu and a Pops and a Nana and a Mimi. I'm just now getting these monikers, okay? Huh? Synonyms, okay. So it is, I told some of you some of the weirdest names I've ever heard for grandmothers. One was Dopey, and one was Battle Axe. I ain't heard nothing that strange in this congregation yet, but I don't know all the monikers yet. So anyway, so thanks to Jack, I've got Debbie's real name down, BB. All right. It is strange that to live in a community where nobody owns the house. The state does. The state, what I mean by that, I mean the house belonged to everybody. Even strangers coming through the city. They were part owners of that house. That's why they were welcome to that house. And we live in a completely different society. And that's sometimes why it's difficult for us to understand some of these stories or parables or illustrations, because we don't live under the conditions and the rules and the norm of their society. And that's why I'm always telling people to try to transport yourself from American society into the Middle Eastern society in order that we might understand these stories better. All right. Having said that, let's get back to our lesson on the importunate widow. Jesus, again, is still in the Perean ministry in his closing days. Now remember, Perea joins what country or what province? Where did the prodigal son go when he took his inheritance and he quickly liquidated it, and he had to run for his life? To where did he run? The Decapolis. The Decapolis bordered Perea. So the prodigal's father and brother lived in Perea. And all of these stories I'm studying you were in Jesus' Perean ministry. They all took place in Perea. And he went across the border into the Decapolis. So that's the explanation for the father always looking up the road down which his son traveled when he left home. He went to the edge of the border of the Decapolis and looked down that road. He was looking into the Decapolis, but he was in Perea. Excuse me. Verse 1, and he spake a parable unto them to this end, that men ought always to pray and not to faint. Carl recently referred to this very verse with respect to a point he was making in his sermon. Luke is the only writer to record this parable. Jesus is still in his Perean ministry. Luke puts more emphasis on Jesus' prayer life than all the other Gospels put together. He emphasized prayer more than any of the other Gospel writers. Not to faint, literally in the Greek, is not to give in to evil. Do not turn coward. Don't lose heart. Don't behave badly. That's what that phrase means. Until the end comes, the disciples must always keep praying and never, never lose heart. Matthew 24:13 says, but he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. I've heard a lot of people talk about patience and that the Bible talks about patience. Yes and no. The Bible never talks about patience as we define it. Sitting there calmly and waiting on your wife to get dressed. That's patience, okay? That's I don't hear any of you women saying anything, or you men. We are waiting for the guy that we're supposed to meet at 10 o'clock, and it's 10 after 10. The Bible never talks about that kind of patience. The word patience means what? The Bible talks about patience with respect to what definition? Endurance. Seeing something through to the end. When you become a Christian, remember, he that endureth to the end, the same shall be saved. Don't become a Christian and quit sometime in that span. When you pray, always pray, not just today, but pray tomorrow and pray the next day. And pray in the morning, but not just in the morning, but through the day. And on we can go. Excuse me. Endurance. If you take on a job, see it through to the end. Don't take that job on for a short time and say, I'm quitting. You might agree in the beginning, I'll take this responsibility for the next 6 months. We can understand that. Let me give you a good example in our own congregation of what importunity is, according to what Bebo has told me. And that's Stan Stevens dealing with these insurance companies. Don told me they objected to this ceiling, and they were trying to get some kind of a fireproof ceiling. I don't know how to explain it, Stan. And that met fire codes, and Stan would tell them this does and all that stuff. He stayed on them so much that they finally gave in, didn't they? All right. In fact, I heard that he stayed with them so much, and he kept pounding and pounding and pounding, that they tried to hire him. They would pay him to do that for them. That's importunity, okay? And he was the right man to go to. All right, so verse 2, saying, there was in a city a judge which feared not God, neither regarded man. In a city a judge. According to the law of Moses, all the cities of Israel were to have their judges who were to administer justice without partiality. I won't get into these scriptures. So clearly this was not a Jewish judge. All Jewish legal disputes were taken before the elders of the synagogue first, but never into the public courts. They did not have public courts. And I'll give you the lowdown on the judiciary of Israel in just a few moments. Regarding legal matters, one man could not constitute a court. There were always at least 3 judges, one chosen by the plaintiff, one by the defendant, and one independently appointed. Now, the judge was one of these paid magistrates, either appointed by the governor or the Roman government, some other member of the Roman government. These judges were notorious, unethical, and heathen, much like our judges today. Unless a plaintiff had influence and money to bribe his way. Now, here's a glitch here. I've corrected it on my hard drive, but I didn't have it corrected at the time I had my wife print these. All right. To bribe his way to a favorable verdict, he had no hope of ever getting his case settled. This judge was an unprincipled man, reckless in his depravity, who had no fear of God, and who had no mercy or respect for his fellow man. Thank you. These allergies have been beating me to death this year. He acted contrary to all the requirements of the law. The Hebrew system of jurisprudence was the greatest system of jurisprudence ever to grace this earth. The American judiciary cannot compare to the Jewish judiciary. It is impossible. How many of you followed the Eichmann trials? How many of you even know who Eichmann was? Eichmann was one of Hitler's henchmen during the Holocaust. And he was on trial for death for war crimes. These judges, when such a person, even as mean as Adolf Eichmann was, goes before a Jewish court, the Jewish Sanhedrin, they bring in judges. They brought in judges from Germany. From Germany. They will give the plaintiff or the defendant every possible break. The job of the Sanhedrin was not to convict the person, but to acquit the person. That was their job. To free him, not to imprison him. They made only one exception in all their history. Who was that exception? Jesus the Christ. They broke every rule in the book because they hated Jesus so much. There were 3 Sanhedrin. Now, many people say Sanhedrin, R-I-N. I always say R-I-M, based upon Alfred Edersheim, the greatest Jewish scholar of the 19th century, the greatest. He was born a Jew of Jewish parents. He knew Judaism as well as any of these Old Testament Jews. He became a convert to Christianity. I've read every book that he has written. He's written 5 wonderful books. And he is the man after whom I follow when I say the Sanhedrin, because of the plurality of these courts. There was the great Sanhedrin, there was the small Sanhedrin, and there was the lower Sanhedrin. The great Sanhedrin was made up of 71 judges. 71. There were 23 priests and 23 elders and 23 scribes. That's 69. And then the high priest, making a total of 70. Some scholars believe that the court was made up of 71 judges and some 72. I'm simply saying 70 for sake of discussion. The Sanhedrin was made up of some of the most unique and rare men you will ever meet in life. I'll read their qualifications in just a few minutes. Then there was the small Sanhedrin, which had 23 judges. And according to one rabbi, a town of at least 230 had to have a small Sanhedrin so that there would be one judge for every 23 residents. And then there was the lower or the local Sanhedrin. And that was made up of 7 judges. The small Sanhedrin met at the gate of the temple complex where the people were coming in. The lower Sanhedrin met in the hall of the Gizeth Hall inside the temple. Now, the temple, if you can picture that hole being the temple, and then the molding on the right and the back and the left, that represented other buildings. The Gazeth chamber would be on the left side up here, on the lower side. And then there would be a hall that would lead in front of all of these buildings. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest would take up his residence in one of those back rooms on that back wall. And he would have to stay there a week before the Day of Atonement, which was the 10th of Tishrei, which would be our October. And he could not have conjugal relationships with his wife. He could not come in contact with anyone because the most sacred day of the year for the Jew was the Day of Atonement. The day of what? What do we call it today? Or the Jews? Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur. All right, so that's the judiciary. Every one of them, and you had to start out with the local Sanhedrin. I'm dealing with these 3 Sanhedrin now. The local Sanhedrin. Then you could appeal your case, or if the case, well, you couldn't really appeal. But if the case warranted, then the small Sanhedrin would take it up. And then sometimes the great Sanhedrin would take it up. But you really couldn't appeal the decision of a Sanhedrin. Let me read to you the qualifications from Alfred Edersheim on the members of the great Sanhedrin. They had to be morally and physically blameless. Absolutely no moral fault. All right? No physical blemish. They had to be as pure as any sacrificial animal. They could not have a crooked finger. They could not have a hair. If they had gray hair, they couldn't have a black hair that showed. They could not have an eye that drooped. They could not have a wart that could be seen. I mean, they had to be as perfect as a manufacturer makes a little doll. Everything. Number 2, They had to be middle-aged, tall, good-looking, and wealthy. 3, they had to be very learned, both in divine law and diverse branches of profane science, such as, they had to have degrees, as we would say today, college degrees in these subjects: medicine, mathematics, astronomy, magic, idolatry, and on and on. The reason being that that judge might have to judge in these matters. What if they had a case of malpractice? That judge had to know how to operate the way that doctor operates. He had to know the same thing that doctor knows, because he is representing that doctor. All right? So whatever kind of person was brought to that court, that judge had to fit the shoes of that defendant or that plaintiff. All right, number 4, he had to know several languages, so they would not be dependent upon translators or interpreters. All right? When in Ackman's trial, I had a DVD on this, or the old tapes. They brought this German judge or lawyer into the Sanhedrin. I still call it the Sanhedrin. I don't know if they do today. All of these judges knew German. They didn't have to have an interpreter. They knew exactly what that German lawyer was saying, because that's a qualification of a judge. They had to know all the languages of anybody in that part of the world that would be brought before their presence. Now, they had to know these languages in case they judged the case of a foreigner. Number 5, they had to have been a judge in their own native town. So if they came from Caesarea, they had to have been a judge in Caesarea before they could become a judge in the great Sanhedrin. Number 6, they had to have been transferred from the judgeship, say in Caesarea, to the lower Sanhedrin, which sat at the Temple Mount. Now, the Temple Mount simply means, the word mount simply refers to Mount Moriah, on which the temple was built. And at the gate entrance of that temple, this is where that small Sanhedrin met. All right, and number 7, they had to have advanced from the lower Sanhedrin to the small Sanhedrin, and then to the great Sanhedrin. And this small Sanhedrin is the one that sat in the Gazeth chamber on the west side of the temple. Now, how many men do you know that meet these qualifications? I don't know any. I don't know any. The Great Sanhedrin was the fairest court that has ever existed on God's earth, except when it came to Jesus. All right, let's go to the lower part of verse 2. Neither regarded man. Here is a present middle. All that means is it involves the individual. Middle always involves the individual himself. To turn one on himself, to shame one, to reverence one. This was a hard-hearted judge who knew no one as his superior. He didn't care about anybody. Now look at verse 3. And there was a widow in that town or city, and she came unto him, saying, Avenge me of mine adversary. Luke mentions widows more than all the other gospel writers combined. So he emphasizes the prayer life of Jesus more than the other 3. He emphasizes widows more than all of the other 3 put together. Look at some of these verses. In Luke chapter 2, verses 37 and 38, we have the story of the parents of Jesus taking the little boy to the temple on the 8th day. of his life. What was significant about that? Why did they go to the temple on the 8th day? What? That's it. I heard circumcision. Yeah. They had to circumcise the little boy on the 8th day. They also had to give him his angelic name. Even though he was named before he was born, they had to officialize that on the 8th day of his life. They circumcised a little male on the 8th day. They gave that boy his name. Even John the Baptist, though he was named before he was born, all right, and his father was going to call him Zacharias after himself, but the angel said, no, he's going to be called John. And so Zacharias and Elizabeth agreed to that. Then they had to redeem the little boy. All right. Jesus was the firstborn, right? John was the firstborn. The firstborn male had to be redeemed. I'm talking about human beings and animals. If a sheep had their first lamb, that lamb belonged to God, not to that owner. If that donkey had a little foal, that donkey belonged to God, but the donkey was an unclean animal. And what, therefore, was the owner obligated to do in redeeming that foal? He could not be sacrificed. He could not be eaten. He had to break his neck, pay money for him, and break his neck. Now, the amount of money that we're dealing with were 5 shekels. After the Tyrian shekel, that was $2.62 for a shekel, not the average shekel of 35 cents. So it cost Joseph and Mary $13 U.S. money to redeem Jesus on that 8th day. Then at the end of the month, Mary had to go to the temple for what purpose? Purification. Now, let me give you a word or two on purification. The Jews did not believe there was any sin in sexual relationship between a husband and his wife. But they equated sin with the entrance of life into the world. And she had to be purified because of that, and not because she had sex with Joseph. Okay? Now, there are a lot of religions who put evil in sex. There's nothing evil in a sexual relationship between a husband and a wife. It's pure. The marriage bed is what? Undefiled. But with the beginning of life, sin was making its entrance into the world. Now, the woman didn't have to go to the temple to be purified. She could do this through what is called stationary men who assisted the priests in all of these sacrifices. But anyway, on the 8th day, that was what took place. Now, on this 8th day, there was a man and a woman whom God led to the temple in order that they might get a glimpse of the Messiah child before they died. Who were they? One was a widow. These weren't husband and wife. One was a widow named Anna. The other was a man named Simeon. And God led them to the temple. It's a beautiful story to study, but I won't get into any details on that. So that's the first widow that Luke talks about. And then in chapter 4, verses 25 and 26, he refers to the widow of Zarephath, and some say Sarepta is another name for that. He goes back to the Old Testament for this illustration. Does anything ring your bell with regard to the widow of Zarephath? She was out picking up sticks to kindle a fire so that she and her only son could eat. she could fix a meal. Who was the prophet involved in this? Elijah. Your parson said Elijah. I heard him. All right, Elijah. He goes up to her and says, "Can you give me a drink of water?" So she gives him a drink. Then he says, "Can you give me a morsel of bread?" And what does she basically say? Look, I'm getting ready to fix a meal, the only food we have for me and my son that we will not die. He says, "You give me a meal first." What does she do? She does it. Isn't that beautiful? Having such faith in a stranger, she gives it to him, and then ultimately her son dies. And what does Elijah do? He brings him back to life. Again, a beautiful story. So she had already lost her husband. So Luke talks about this widow of Zarephath. And then in Luke 11:17 through, Luke's 11:17, we talked recently about the widow of Nain. Jesus and his disciples are headed to Nain, and they behold what coming out of the city? A funeral procession. A funeral procession. As they approach that funeral procession, they notice that there is a widow woman. And they learn that she had lost her only son. So she also had lost a husband. Now she loses her only son. And Jesus goes up to the bearers of the pall, and he touches the bier, B-I-E-R, which is a no-no. When you touch something in which a corpse or a decedent is being carried, that defiles you. And he touched it in order that the pallbearers might stop. And then ultimately he raises him from the dead. Then there is the story that we are studying here in Luke 18, the unfortunate widow. Then in Luke 20, verses 45 through 47, he chides the Pharisees for devouring widows' houses. What does that mean? Here is a widow who loses her husband. And these wicked Pharisees take advantage of that, and they kick her out of her own house. They eat up her dwelling, leaving her stranded, living on the streets. Can you believe that? Of the religious leaders doing this? That's the kind of Pharisees with whom Jesus dealt. And then in Luke 21, 1 through 4, we have the story of the widow. Jesus is observing the treasury. As you go into the court, just before you go in, here's the temple, all right? As you enter from the east side, you always enter from the east, all right? Since I've already drawn the picture, I don't want the east to be that side. All right, so you enter from the east at the gate, and then before you go into the temple, there is a gate called Beautiful. The Gate Beautiful. Now, does that ring a bell? What can you tell me about the Gate Beautiful? There was a lame man that laid there, and what did he ask of Peter and John? Alms. They said, "Silver and gold have we none." And so they healed that man at the Gate Beautiful. Now, the Gate Beautiful enters into the very first compartment of the temple, which is called the Court of the Women. The Court of the Women. Now, let's let that little hole represent that Court of the Women. In each corner were treasures. These were trumpets. These were big vases in the shape of trumpets. All right? Small at the top, and they bellied out at the bottom. There were 13 of these treasures in the court of the women. That was the treasury. So as you walk around the hall on the outside, you come across all 13 of these treasuries. Now, when Paul talks in Acts, in fact, I'll refer to it in just a minute, about the Grecian widows murmured against the Jewish widows because the Grecian widows were not being treated fairly. In fact, let's turn to that. Acts 6, okay? Turn to Acts 6. Verse 1. And in those days, when the number of the disciples was multiplied, there arose a murmuring of the Grecians against the Hebrews, because their widows, that is the Grecians' widows, were neglected in the daily ministration. Daily ministration. I have a breakdown of what every one of these 13 treasures or these vases was for. One was for the education of the poor children. One was for the widows. Is that it? Okay. I'll leave you hanging until next week.